Research and Extension Center. She'll be talking about Caneberry 2016 insecticide miticide decline study. Is that okay?
Good afternoon. Joe DeFrancesco of OSU and myself are funded by the Red Raspberry Commission in Washington and also by the Oregon Red Raspberry Blackberry Commission to look at a decline study of insecticides and miticides in caneberries. It was performed at 2 different locations. Joe performed both a raspberry and a blackberry study in Aurora, and I performed a red raspberry study in Linden. There were about 12 different treatments. We replicated them 3 times for ourselves and 4 times in Oregon. Oregon, we performed an over-the-road boom sprayer, and also in Oregon, they did a backpack sprayer. For these types of decline studies, I think it's important to get a broad range of residue parts per million so that we have a representative sample of what it might be in different localities. The analyses were performed by Synergistic Pesticide Laboratory in Portland, and you'll notice that the MRLs are usually but not always the same for raspberry and blackberry. These samples were sent frozen overnight to Camille by us, and they were hand delivered by the Oregon group. Acequinacil unfortunately did not work analytically, so we did not get any residues for that material. Acequinacil is Canemite. There were 2 different materials that were not registered. One was Scientilla Pro, or XRL. We went ahead and performed that because we're anticipating the registration this coming year, and it'll give us an idea of the decline. We performed residue analysis on a gallon product. You might know it as Savvy. It's going to be a new formulation. This one is an EC formulation compared to the dust or the powder that you're normally used to. So let me kind of give you an introduction to these graphs that I'll be talking about. On the upper right side in here, you're going to see the MRLs for red raspberry and blackberry for these target export markets. These were recommended by Henry and also by Joe. You'll see that the black line represents the Washington raspberries, green will be the Oregon raspberries, and the purple will be the Oregon blackberries. You'll see 2 different, you'll see a line that represents right here. This represents the U.S. Domestic parts per million, or our tolerance level. And right here, you'll be seeing the PHI. This one is bifenthrin. This is your cleanup spray. And for this one, all the residues were less than 1 parts per million at 3 DAT, which is our PHI. So there were no problems with any of our target markets with bifenthrin. For Carbaryl, Carbaryl is quite an old material. This was introduced in 1958. This one is also known as 7. Anytime you see a band over here in the MRL area, that means that there's a change between the red raspberry and blackberry tolerances within that country. For this one, you can see that at 7 DAT, we're going to be below the US parts per million of 12. As we will for all of those. But for the 10 parts per million that's required by Canada, Australia for blackberry, it takes 7 DAT before that is reached. Unfortunately for Korea, we can never reach their tolerance level of 0.5 because we had that amount beyond 21 days. Scientilla Pro, this is XRL. Again, this one is not registered yet, but it will be in 2017. At least we anticipate this. We anticipate a 3-day PHI. There are no tolerances set for this material yet. The residues were greater than 0.1 parts per million past 21 DAT in red raspberries. And the reason why I mention this is because the default tolerance for Japan is set at 0.01. This is the limit of quantification, and this one is not reachable in this case. For Psypromethean and zeta Psypromethean, this was another bit of a interesting problem. You had our tolerances set at 0.8, and we were supposed to be able to reach these within 1 day or 1 PHI. Unfortunately, you can see that our tolerances right here were all above for everything that we did, above that, that tolerance level. We don't understand why this occurred, and this is something we'll be looking into in the next 3 years when we perform a larger study. The residues at around 0.5 parts per million were reachable by day 7. And so, you know, unlike blueberry, where if you look at these decline studies, it provides growers an opportunity to manipulate harvest by delaying a day or so. Red raspberries are a much more fragile berry, so there may be less option to manipulate that pre-harvest interval and extend it. So in some cases, this is going to eliminate some of these products for these target countries. For Canada, it has a no tolerance of 0.1, and it remains at 0.1 through 21 days. Fenpropathrine, this is danitol. This is a pyrethroid, and like most of your pyrethroids, you're going to see a real gradual decline, and this is exhibited by this curve right in here. You can see how it declines slowly and remains for quite some time. Our pre-harvest interval is 3 days, and at that point, we're supposed to be able to reach 12 parts per million. And of course, right here, there's no line because it is way off the charts. So the residues were less than 3 parts per million at 3 DAT, and that is the Taiwan's parts per million tolerances. It took between 10 and 18 days for us to reach the 0.5 tolerances for red raspberry, and Korea has a tolerance level of 0.5. So often if you look over here at this chart and you see these lowest numbers right here, those are the ones you want to look for and see how long it took to reach those tolerances. It took greater than 14 days for blueberry to reach the 0.5 parts per million. And unfortunately, again, the residues were detectable past 21 days for the Washington red raspberries. You'll notice that the Oregon red raspberry study stopped at 14 days, but Joe has those berries, and he will be analyzing those. So that information will be forthcoming. Hexytoxin or savvy, you know this is an ovocyde. So this is a miticide. It's often tank mixed with other materials. This one was sort of an interesting one too. We have a 3-day PHI, and ours is set at 1 part per million. And if you look right here, there's a bit of a problem. So for hexytoxin, we were over the U.S. tolerance, domestic tolerances for this material, and we really don't quite understand why that occurred. It occurred for both Joe's blackberries and also for our red raspberries. You can see that by between 5 and 7 days, we were able to get below that 1 parts per million point. The full label rate was used here, which is 6 ounces of product per acre. And you can see that this material extends for a long time and sticks around for a long time. And this certainly is one of those materials that does have long residual activity. Here's another formulation. This is the newer formulation that's going to be coming out. We wanted to see whether there would be any difference in decline rates between the 2 different formulations. So does a dust decline any slower than a liquid? You'll be seeing this answer in the next slide. For this one, we're looking at Joe's blackberries and our red raspberries. And again, we were below this parts per million only because we used a 70% or a mid-field rate. We didn't use the full field rate on this material. Joe did use the full field rate, and yes, again, he was above that PHI, that domestic tolerance level. So there's something going on, and we're going to look at that a little closer. So here's a comparison between the 2 different formulations. And you can see that there were 2 raspberry, we're comparing the 2 different savvies for the 2 different raspberries in Washington. And we're looking at the 2 different formulations on blackberry. And it turns out that the formulations decline at the same rate. And you can see there's very little difference here in Joe's. They lay right on top of one another. Ours are a little bit different, but again, we were using that 70% field rate for the EC. And there was the line, and there was our 3-day PHI limit. You can see that in this case, Canada has a higher parts per million, a higher tolerance than we do. So actually at 3-DAT, we're able to reach Canada's tolerance limits. For imidacloprid, this is a systemic product, also known as Admire Pro. And you can see in this case, the tolerances are really quite all over the place. US has a 3-day PHI of 2.5, and it goes on down to Korea, which has 0.5 for red raspberry, and for blackberry it's even lower, it's at 0.3. Australia is pretty high at 5, so is Japan. So at 3-day PHI, we were way below our tolerance level. So that's why you don't see the yellow line in this case. All the residues were below 1 part per million. The blackberry residues were less than that 0.3 parts per million between 3 and 4 days. So it's a little bit of an issue with Korea and trying to export blackberries to Korea. Malathion, this one exhibits a much different type of decline than you've seen in some of the others. All right, looking back at this one and back at some of the others, they have a nice gradual slope. But in the case of Malathion, you're going to see it experiences a real steep decline around 3-DAT, between 2 and 3-DAT. And this has an effect on its efficacy for spotted wing Drosophila, as it does for this drop in parts per million. So at 1-DAT, which is our pre-harvest interval, we have to reach 8, and we were well below that. If you look over at the chart over here, you can see that for Korea, we need to reach 0.5. And so this one, it takes 4 to 5 days following treatment to be able to reach that level for Korea. Unfortunately, these residues were detected at a level of 0.1 parts per million past 21 days, so it won't work for Taiwan. Spinetoram, this one is related to success. It's a spinosad type, really an advanced molecule. You can see over here in our MRL area that Japan has differences in the tolerances it's set for red raspberry versus blackberry, a little lower in blackberry, as well as Taiwan. It has the lowest, and it's down to 0.01 for blackberry. So on our PHI, which is 1-day PHI, we were well below our 0.8 parts per million. All the residues were below 0.5 parts per million, and that's important for Taiwan, especially for the red raspberry. Residues were less than 0.05 after 10 days, so that's going to affect the Korean red raspberry shipments. And also after 14 days, it was less than 0.01, but there's no berries after 14 days, so it doesn't matter. Spinosad, this is another molecule related to Spinetoram. This one is also known as success. This one, you can look at the MRL chart over here and see that Korea has a 0.5, and this jumps around a little bit too. Our PHI is at 1 day, and at this point, we should be able to reach 1 part per million for both red raspberry and blackberry. And you can see that, of course, there is no yellow line, so it's way off the chart. So we were able to reach that with no problem. Even Australia's 0.7, no problem. Canada, 0.5. And that is a little bit of a problem here because you're going to see that our red raspberry was above that limit on 1-DAT. So in summary, these things we think that make a difference as far as this decline study and things we were able to draw out of it. So if you look at these, you're going to notice that the US PHI will be in parentheses. And so if you follow along, you're going to see that with bifenthrin and spinosad, we were able to meet the MRLs for the US and for all the other countries. For Carbaryl, which has a 7-day PHI, we met the MRLs for all countries except for Korea and Taiwan. And in that case, we need to wait 21 days for Korea and Taiwan, so it doesn't look like it's going to be possible to utilize that material for those 2 countries. Spinetoram meets MRLs for all countries except for Korea and Taiwan. For Korea, you have to wait over 10 days. For Taiwan, you have to wait at least 14 days. Malathion meets the MRLs for all countries except for Korea and Taiwan. For Korea, though, you're going to have to wait 5 days, and for Taiwan, you're going to have to wait 21 days. Imidacloprid. This one meets the MRLs for all countries except for blackberry. And you need to wait 4 days instead of 3 in that country. Residue declines for the 2 formulations of hexythiazox or SABI did not differ in their decline rates. Both formulations are okay for Canada, but excessive residues for the US and other countries is something that we're going to have to determine what happened in our studies. Psypromethean, this one was okay for Taiwan, but excessive residues occurred for US and the other countries, and we're going to need to wait 5 days, and that one is another mystery. So Psypromethean and hexythiazox are the ones that we're going to be looking at again. We don't know of anybody else that's looking at the miticides and looking at decline curves for miticides, and so I think that this is really valuable information. Finpropathrine, we meet the MRLs for all countries except for Australia, which has a 0 parts per million, and also Korea, and it takes 18 days before we meet the limit set by Korea. Scientilla Pro, not registered yet. We expect it in 2017. And the blueberry MRL that has been set is at 4. We were able to reach 0.6 parts per million at the anticipated 3-day PHI. So it looks like we're going to be well below that of something like blueberry. So we don't know yet what the PHI is going to be, nor the parts per million that's going to be acceptable residues. We are going to continue studying the miticides and insecticides and fungicide decline studies on caneberries. We've received a task funding for the next 3 years, and it'll be we'll be working with the Red Raspberry Commission and again the Oregon Raspberry Blackberry Commission. And then these 3 years of data will be piled on top of this one, and that should provide a better representation of degradation curves. So, of course, we're going to look again at hexythiazox and the Psypromethean issues, which both of ours were above the U.S. tolerance levels. So, thank you very much.
All right, we can take one question. We'll have to keep moving on. Thanks, Bev.